Thank you, Professor Naidu in the chair. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to begin firstly by complimenting Ikriyar and Mr. Pulipaka for spearheading a subject and constantly flagging the significance, both strategic and economic, of the Asia-Pacific region and in an evolving Asian strategic chessboard, as has been discussed adequately in the first session. Couldn't have been a better time, in fact, to convene this discussion given the recently concluded ASEAN-India summit in Malaysia, which underscored not just the vitality of the region, but also that of its stakeholders. I'll be speaking on the Chinese approach, the Chinese thinking, and the Chinese take on regionalism in the Asia-Pacific, and I'll be briefly touching upon how China configures and sees power in the construct of the region, the three evolutions of Chinese regionalism, the significance and exclusivity of the ASEAN 3, particularly as a mechanism, President Xi Jinping's Peripheral Diplomacy initiative and the dual-track approach towards this region, and finally deliberating upon the question whether China in fact is a constructive contributor to the Asia-Pacific or in fact a divisive saboteur in the region. I won't spend too much time into the historical facet of the subject, primarily because of the constraint of time. So 78, 79, we saw Deng Xiaoping's push for reform and modernization, and this was the phase after which China actually developed a full-fledged foreign policy. And by around the 60s, the decade of the 60s, China had inherent hostility towards the entire construct of Asian regionalism because it thought that it was majorly represented by the ASEAN states, and which was viewed from a Chinese perspective as an anti-communist tool used by the imperialists. In the mid-1990s, however, China did begin active participation in Asian regionalism and forums, and the post-Cold War period, in fact, set the ball rolling primarily because how would an international system develop was the primary question. At the same time, it was very interesting that in 97 in the CCP Congress, Chiang Zemin stated that China needs to actively participate in multilateral diplomacy and such initiatives. China saw multilateralism as a strategy which was in consonance with its overall national interest. However, what was important to note was that it argued for a limited version of multilateralism, and this facet is something that continues to loom large even till date. The Chinese look at power through the concept and construct of what they term as "she," which is very heavily focused on internal debates in the Chinese parlance. They focus on direction and change in which nation states and actors act as well as interact. The concept of "she" conceptually involves Gaoqi Gichu, which primarily refers to the international power configurations in the region. Identifying "she" as a concept is a central concern for China while conceiving its international strategy, and this applies very well to the Asia-Pacific region per se. China understands unipolarity in what they state is that the United States continues to remain the most important prominent player, along with its allies and partners, to implement its strategies in the Asia-Pacific. And China, as a response, tends to apply and reply with a mixed strategy wherein the South China Sea conflict is not entirely isolated from China's overall relationship with the Asia-Pacific region. I personally feel that there are three particular evolutions in China's approach to regionalism and Chinese regionalism per se in the Asia-Pacific. First, the attitude of China towards regionalism has evolved from hostile to being an active participant, as I just mentioned. Secondly, the geographic area to practice regionalism has significantly enlarged from a Chinese perspective. It's not just merely confined to East Asia, but the entire Asia-Pacific region per se. And thirdly, China's role in Asian regionalism has transformed. It's a greater stakeholder as it aspires to be a great power in the world. And most important, this leads to how China has a difficult equation with the United States in the region and how they are trying to sort of adjust to each other. The Chinese participating role in regionalism hinges on its relationship with Washington. The primary argument that Chinese policymakers make is that China's ability to assert is often constrained by the United States' presence. The domestic discourse in internal Chinese publications states that US intent on mobilizing regional states leads to containment of China. And there is a lot of discomfort in China vis-a-vis the American military rebalance in Asia that has been discussed even in the first session. In fact, they often allude to two recent developments, which was the Hillary Clinton's forward deployed diplomacy in the Asia-Pacific, which she alluded to as Secretary of State way back in 2010, where the emphasis was to quicken the pace and widen the scope of United States engagement with its partners and its allies. And the Obama's tour around China, this has been given a lot of significance within China and the internal discourse, because they feel that the ultimate competition now is between US-Asian pivot versus China's renewed assertiveness in regionalism and the forums in the region. I'd like to focus, there are many platforms for regionalism and for multilateral cooperation, but I think one of the most important is the ASEAN plus 3, especially from a Chinese perspective. In the 1990s, when ASEAN was actively searching for new regional strategies, in 97, the Asian financial crisis happened, and which sort of underlined the significance of interdependence in the region. Therefore, regionalism at that point of time received a lot of momentum in that part of the world, and it led to the birth of the ASEAN plus 3 initiative consisting of the 10 ASEAN member states as well as China, Japan, and South Korea. China considers ASEAN plus 3 as its preferred vehicle and for regional diplomacy, primarily because they feel that ASEAN plus 3 as a mechanism remains indigenous to East Asia. In fact, ASEAN plus 3 has become the first instance of institutionalization of regionalism in the region. I won't delve too much into economic regionalism, but it's extremely important to understand it from a Chinese perspective. The Chinese approach towards economic regionalism is through the concept of le, which means interest. This is a new initiative of Xi Jinping, promoting China's economic diplomacy with developing countries. China's pursuit of economic regionalism comes in form of the very well discussed Silk Road Economic Belt, as well as the Maritime Silk Route initiatives by President Xi. However, the larger question remains that will economic integration suffice for the region, given the inherent problems between countries? The regionalism in the Asia-Pacific continues to be market-driven, as we all know, but economic issues are just one facet which are typical to the region. For example, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership of 16 countries, primarily India, New Zealand, Australia, China, Japan, South Korea, plus the 10 member states of the ASEAN, they already have 86 billion of trade deficit that they suffer with China. So even if you have an economic integration happening, there are inherent problems which are going to create serious challenges in the future vis-a-vis even economic integration. So economics alone cannot provide the sufficient cushion to transform relations and the entire approach to regionalism in this part. As far as the Peripheral Diplomacy initiative of President Xi Jinping is concerned, they have been focusing, both President Xi and Premier Li Keqiang have stressed on this initiative. The primary aim is to upgrade Chinese position in the region, and this has been manifested through multiple foreign visits of Foreign Minister Wang Yi. It highlights that the region continues to remain a top priority for China. Even at the 48th ASEAN ministerial meeting earlier this year in August, Foreign Minister Wang Yi highlighted China's dual-track approach, wherein the stability in the South China Sea has to be maintained by China as well as the ASEAN nations. In the dual-track approach, the negotiations on the South China Sea disputes can be performed under a multilateral framework. This is how the Chinese begin to approach this approach. However, they also simultaneously state that China does not accept any international judicial or arbitral jurisdiction stipulated by the UNCLOS. So there are inherent contradictions as to how the Chinese are approaching these issues. Any dispute pertaining maritime delimitation, territory, and military activities is going to be contested. And China has repeatedly asserted that the South China Sea disputes should not be discussed at ASEAN meetings, since it is not the right forum. And this has come under a lot of question, primarily because ASEAN is a regional forum, and the issues of regional security concerns are bound to occur and bound to arise, which need to be addressed and discussed. China remains fully involved in most regional security meetings organized by ASEAN, so it becomes extremely questionable as to how can these issues not be discussed in these forums. So therefore, the bottom line would be that Beijing would not really compromise on its claims in the East and the South China Seas, and the dialogue and consultations by no means denotes unconditional compromise. This was stated by none less than Lieutenant General Xi, who is the Deputy Chief of China's PLA at the 2013 Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. So this brings us to the major question: where does the validity of the ASEAN Plus 3 lie? The future of regionalism continues to be uncertain in the Asia-Pacific. The primary expectation of the nation states and stakeholders is for China to be more forthcoming and more transparent, especially on matters which pertain security and security cooperation. Growth of China's military power is not equivalent to its clarity on strategic intentions. And this, in fact, causes a rise in regional friction and collective prosperity. Perhaps the biggest constraint for regionalism becoming operationally effective in the Asia-Pacific is the China-Japan relationship and the inherent trust deficit between the two countries. This puts a major question mark on the future of ASEAN Plus 3 as a framework. And the focus of China on sovereignty issues, which was discussed in the first session as well, figures heavily when China pursues its regionalism. China seeks to the following aims and objectives. It seeks national rejuvenation, national reunification, political autonomy, and achieving rejuvenation of China as a great nation. There is a seeming fixation with absolute sovereignty and the concept of absolute sovereignty. And this, in fact, hinders development of preventive diplomacy and conflict resolution, and what is expected out of China as a major stakeholder in the region, not just within ASEAN Plus 3, but other regional levels as well. So are we seeing that China is, by virtue of its military power and the robust military modernization program, as well as that of the PLA Navy, is there a quest to alter the maritime status quo in the region? The regionalism per se is becoming hamstrung because of Beijing's hardline position on territorial claims in the South China Sea. In fact, Professor Kondapalli earlier also mentioned about the fiery cross reef of the Spratly Islands, which has been transformed into an artificial island. This entire island was almost untouched by man-made structures in March 2014. But by 2015, you had a flotilla of Chinese vessels undertaking land dredging activities. They have created ports and battlements, perhaps the biggest land reclamation project, with nearly 800 hectares of submerged reef that has been converted into dry land. So are we looking at the potential return to a hierarchical Sino-centric order remains the question. In conclusion, I'd come to the last question that I had addressed, that whether China is being looked upon as a constructive contributor or a divisive saboteur to the region. The regionalism strategy employed by China is a means to guarantee its peaceful rise or development, as has been debated since long. The future trajectory of China continues to remain uncertain, and the rising capabilities, especially that of the PLA Navy, are a source of immediate attention. This entire construct and this debate leads to the fact and to the question that inherently the very theories of functional integration in this region are being sorely tested. And the question is that will Asian regionalism hold vis-a-vis rise of a new round of great power rivalry in Asia? In my opinion, the prospect of permanent stability continues to remain bleak, and there will be a continuing paradox of new security formations amid interdependent economies, and this facet shall define the future of the Asia-Pacific region and that of the prospect and the future of regionalism in the region per se. I thank you all for giving me a patient hearing. I welcome your questions and comments. Thank you.